Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 of my interview with Graeme Bayless. Now, part 1, in case you haven't seen it already, we talked about his beginning at doing some work for Accolade, moving on to SSI, Sega's Technical Institute, and then FMV, cutting-edge company Hyperbole, and where he made the decision to fire himself. So that's where we're going to be picking up today and finding out what the next stage in his very long and very interesting career takes us.
To be blunt, it was the right call for the company, right? They went on to continue to stay afloat for a while. They were carrying too much cost, too many people for what they were doing. They were trying to grow in a way that was not viable given their approach to the business and the type of product that they wanted to do. It was definitely a niche product. It didn't, I think they had aspirations for that to become a, future of the industry type of thing. But I don't think that was ever particularly in the cards. I'll simply say that it was a well-timed fad, if you will, and maybe even not well-timed, but it was a fad. And as the technology evolved, it kind of, became a different, it became a part of a thing, not a thing. And so.
Oh, sorry. That was a beautiful way of describing FMV games. It became part of a thing, not a thing.
Right. Exactly. I mean, it was no longer that, hey, we're an FMV game, therefore we're cool. It was, hey, we have FMV, which is part of our game, which is cool. It's a very, very different thing. And so, that changed their business. That, doing that and sort of trimming down the company and getting down to the core people who really had the strong passion for that type of storytelling was the right call for them. And they ended up, connecting, getting the license for the X-Files game. And I'm very happy that they did that. And, they have, obviously the company eventually did, mostly spin down. You're telling me the other day that it was not that long ago it still existed. It was interesting, but I've had loose contact over the years with the former principals from the company. As far as I know, they're off doing other things. So, it was the right call. It was also the right call for me. You had asked before, was it me making the call for, for the good of the company, or was it me making the call for the good of me? And in total candor, there was a bit of both, right? It was, but I was genuinely trying to do the best I could for the company and trying to give them the best advice I could, because that was part of what I was responsible for doing. And, like I've said before, if there's one thing that you should know about me is that I kind of, sometimes for better or for worse, I don't pull punches and I try to tell it like it is. And sometimes that means looking at myself. And, I try very hard to be the first person to own up when I blow it. And I have blown it plenty. And so, this was a case of me kind of trying to lean into that and saying, hey, this is the right move for you. So
I hear you. And hey, let's face it, if you haven't failed, you haven't really tried.
Well, I mean, I have long believed that you're defined by how you handle adversity. How you handle success, that's wonderful and all, but how you handle the tough times, that kind of defines who you are. And, there are plenty of people who can be far more eloquent about resilience than I. But I do believe very much that, the challenges are often the things that we learn from the best. And, certainly as a manager and a mentor through the years, I have discovered that as well, is that it's very hard to tell somebody something and just have them believe it and learn it. It's much, much easier once they have had a sort of the physical taste of whatever it is, the challenge that you're trying to help them avoid, before they go, oh, I get it now. and so, yeah. For me, I've never been shy about failure. When we get far enough forward into Namco, I'll talk a little bit about some of the learnings that I took away from that place. But one of them was the realization that from a Japanese company perspective, I am a madman. Because, one of the things we went through was cultural training. And one of the things that in that cultural training, it sort of enlightened me as a rule, and this is an overgeneralization, I realize, but as a rule, Japanese companies tend to be more conservative and more risk averse, much like German companies. And so they did this exercise where everybody in the room ended up graded on a 1 to 5 scale of how risk averse, or rather how embracing of risk were you, with 5 being you're willing to take risks, you're almost reckless, and 1 being you're ultra conservative. And everybody in the room was 3 or below. Many were in the 2 range, and I was 4.2.
Ooh.
I was the cowboy in the room, right? And that's been true of me, pretty much all along. Which is interesting because I chose the profession of producer, which is by a generality, a risk averse job. But those don't, in my mind, they're not mutually exclusive, because understanding risk is the sort of cornerstone of that. So as a producer, I spend a lot of time thinking about risk, looking at risk, and trying to decide when to take smart risks. But that doesn't mean I don't take risks. I very much do. And, to the point you made a minute ago, if you aren't willing to stub your toe occasionally, you will miss opportunities left and right. So
definitely. So Hyperbole is going to have to continue on without you.
Yes.
You've just laid yourself off.
Yes.
What does one do after one lays oneself off?
Well, you panic a little bit because you're unemployed, but again, I'm a reasonably smart person. I have a good background. I understand games from multiple perspectives. I have a production background. I have a design background. And so it didn't feel like it was going to be, and at the time it felt like I wasn't super worried about being able to find a job. And truth be told, it didn't take me terribly long. I talked to a number of possible options, but I ended up at Dynamix, which was a part of Sierra. Dynamix was a little, very interesting little studio in Eugene, Oregon. And I'm telling you, but I'm really, I guess, telling your audience because you know very well who they are. Yeah. But they had an interesting mix of games, ranging from sort of historical, flight simulation games like Red Baron or Ace of the Pacific. They also had sort of interesting toy tinker games like The Incredible Machine. And then they had a legacy of some really interesting RPGs, right? And so they were a very diverse company. And at the time, I didn't really understand sort of why that was when I joined them. But I was like, that I like their products, and I like, the way that they thought. I really liked their GM. And so a guy by the name of Tony Renicky, who I have no idea even where Tony is anymore. But he was an interesting cat. I mean, he had a trophy on his wall from when he did the Iditarod,
Wow.
Yeah, that's not a small deal, right?
No.
He had a rule. Basically, you would get warned if you showed up at the company in a tie. You would get one warning. If you showed up at the company again in a tie, he would cut it off. And he carried through on that threat with his lawyers at one point.
Wow.
So he's just an interesting cat. Yeah, I mean, they were an interesting place, and obviously part of Sierra. Sierra's a big, entity, right? And so anyway, I joined them, and ostensibly when I joined, it was to, it was to be a director type. So they had a very distinctive line between director and producer, right? They had a producer, which would be a project manager, and then they had a director who was responsible for sort of game, direction, right? Creative director is not the right term, but more like a development director, design director rolled up into one sort of thing. One was focused on product, one was focused on market. And that kind of went away very quickly for me. I ended up sort of blending both. And so while my title was officially director, I kind of stood on both sides of that fence. But yeah, I joined that company. There's a lot of interesting stuff that they had going on. Sierra, as you know, was working on this initiative for the thing that became known as the Imagination Network.
Now, just to put it in historical perspective, we're talking about 94 at this point, right? Or
that's correct, I think. Yes, I think that's yes. Hold on, I'll look it up. I'll look at my own history and then I'll tell you. And the answer is yes. Very good. Of course, you might be cheating, and also he might.
No, I'm not cheating because I was basing it off of the games that you listed, and also the history of Hyperbole. It would have had to have been 94 then.
Right.
So
Sorry,
anyway, I'm just that good.
No, that you are. So anyway, they had an initiative that had been going for a while, the Imagination Network, which was very interesting, right? And this was a time where I certainly we all saw sort of the advent of online and what that meant. On a personal note, I met my wife in 1989 online. And in fact, I am one of the very first online couples, which is to say that I met my wife in a chat room and talking about books. We were both fans of a particular fantasy series, and we got chatting one day, and that ended up with a phone call that led to phone calls for months, and then met up, and literally a year to the day after we first spoke, we got married.
Oh, that is beautiful.
And we are still married to this day. So that is now 33 years and going strong. So, we are literally one of the very first internet, romances, if you will.
That's brilliant. Now, I got to ask, which chat service were you using, and what was the book series?
So the service was the predecessor to AOL. Right. So that was called, what was it? Something Link? What?
Quantum Link.
Yes, there you go. So we were on that. I originally was doing chat rooms for, this is when I was at SSI in the late 80s. And I was doing a chat room for a game called Great Naval Battles, where I was in there basically talking to players and answering questions. And so we had set up a thing where we'd be there and they could talk to the developers. And so I was in the room talking to people. And then after the session was done, I'm like, this is really cool, right? And I saw a room that was talking about David Eddings's series, The Belgariad. And so I dropped into a chat room and just started chatting with somebody who was, named after one of the very interesting characters in the book, Silk, and we just got talking, and then that led to, me rather innocently asking if, we wanted to hop on a call and just keep chatting, and little did I know that, she was like talking to her sister in the other room. Oh, should I do this? This sort of thing. But we ended up talking on the phone, and that led to, everything else. So, but it was a very early sample of that. And so, I use that as a way of explaining that I was definitely interested in online and very interested in, the possibilities there. She was actually, when I joined Dynamix, she was already a user on the Imagination Network. She was very into a game called, what the heck was that? Shadows of Eusebius? That sounds right?
Yeah, a shadow of Eusebius.
Yes, Shadow of Eusebius. Man, I'm actually remembering things. I'm usually don't do that well. I'm old. But anyway, she played on there. It's online RPG. She was on there, and so it definitely resonated for me. And so one of the first projects I was asked to work on was Red Baron for that, right? But that led to me taking on a number of other projects. And actually fairly quickly after joining them, hold on, trying to look up the precise date and see if I can get this right. But fairly quickly after joining, I was asked to take over development of a game called CyberStorm. And there had been the game director had chosen to exit, and I don't really know the highs and lows of it, but that gentleman leaving left a bit of a void, and so I was asked to take over the rest of the project with that small internal team, working on that turn-based strategy game. It was obviously right in my wheelhouse, given my past history, and so they're like, "Hey, take this game on." I was like, absolutely. And so I took over as the director, and I was also the producer at the same time for Mission 4 CyberStorm. It was a really great, very satisfying situation because it was a great little team, small internal team, very talented people, and very passionate about doing those types of games. Like I said, it was right in my wheelhouse. I was a huge fan of mech games like BattleTech and tabletop. And so it was definitely something I was excited about. So that became my focus, and I led that game from basically when I took over, which was kind of halfway through, and they got that completed, and it did really well for us. Them. It's no longer us. Well enough that led to them signing up to do a sequel. It sold 6 figures. That there wasn't a lot of games that sold 7 figures in those days, but it was respectable. It did real well, and especially given the cost, because it was again a small internal team, and so that led to me signing up to do the sequel, which is a whole different story we'll talk about in a minute.
Now, did CyberStorm have an online component?
So it did not. So there's a bit of a story there. It had not. The entire game had not been conceptualized to be an online game. We actually ended up adding online to CyberStorm because we recognized that it was something that was beginning to gain momentum. And obviously, we know sort of where the rest of that company ended up, where, one of the biggest successes they ever had was Tribes, right?
Yeah.
And so there's an amusing side story with Tribes, I'll get to in a second. I didn't work on Tribes, but there were some interesting opportunities that could have played out differently for both Tribes and what eventually became Starsiege. But anyway, I'll circle back to that in a minute. Basically, online became a thing that got injected relatively late, and there's a really awesome story for that. The lead engineer, a guy by the name of Steve Corden, really, really talented engineer. One of those crazy smart types that you're just blessed to get a chance to work with. And I actually went to him on a Friday about 5 p.m. or 4 p.m., something like that. And I said, hey, they're asking about whether we could create an online, multiplayer component of this game, how feasible that would be. We'd like to investigate whether that was something that was possible to do. And he said, well, let me think about it. Let's talk about it on Monday. And I'm like, okay, that sounds great. That's perfect. That's really all I'm asking for. I'm just trying to get an evaluation from a, implementation standpoint of what it would take. Come in Monday morning early. I'm like in there at 8, and Steve's there. Steve's never there that early. I'm like, he's wearing the same clothes he was wearing Friday.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, Steve? And he's like, yeah. I was like, so what's going on? And he's like, well, so, you got me thinking. And long story short, he implemented a multiplayer over the weekend.
Oh, wow.
By himself.
Yeah. As one is wont to do.
From a starting point of 0. I mean, it's just that's the kind of dude he was, right? So it was literally from me asking, hey, what would it take to, oh, look, there it is. What do you know? It's, no multiplayer game. Yeah, funny stuff. But, yeah, it was not envisioned as a multiplayer game originally. But, that's sort of how we ended up.
Now, I have to ask because, like you said, Imagination Network is really an in-house developed thing at Sierra. At this point in time, I believe AT&T is either the majority shareholder or has already bought it out.
Not yet.
Not yet.
So, so you're hitting on something that we should definitely talk about. So when I joined Dynamix, they were still Dynamix and Sierra was still Sierra. And, they were still very much Ken Williams' company, right? My first few quarterly meetings, Ken was at the table and I was giving reports on sort of, how we were doing and what was going on. And it felt like a big game company, a game publisher and one of their developers working together. And I'm not sure I could put a finger on it, but I'll simply say that at some point, Ken reached his threshold of pain. And he said, you know what? I've done enough and I'm out. And so Ken announced he was retiring for all intents and purposes and turned over control to, his number 2. And that began the process that sort of led to the demise of Sierra. And yes, in there we got sold. And actually, there was multiple transactions. It went through this really weird chain where first we got bought by, let's see if I can get the chain right. I think first it was CompuCard International, which was like the people who make the entertainment books.
Yeah.
Right? And then we ended up with Sendent, which is like a banking company. And then we got bought by, what the hell were they called? It was a French utility company, which was the underpinnings of Vivendi, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And eventually that led to this sort of series of chain of events that led to the demise of both of those companies, right? And it happened a little bit in slow motion, but, for the first couple of years, it was really great. It felt like a development company. It felt like it was run by people who loved games. I worked on a variety of interesting projects. The Outpost project, Outpost 2 that went through at that time, I helped sort of wrangle on that one, even though it was a project that had limited passion from most of the company. It was a Ken really passion project for Ken. He really wanted to see it happen. And it was externally developed. It wasn't an internal team. So, it was kind of we're trying to publishing produce it, but, and it had a lot of issues. And, I wasn't at a point in my career where I felt I could try to tell companies, hey, you maybe want to not do this one. It's not going. But I gave some. I do remember giving a really tough report to him at one point. And I'm trying to remember the exact phrasing because it was one of those moments where basically he was asking for a status update, and he was super enthusiastic. He was all kinds of jazzed, and he was like, okay, so I heard that they were making some changes to the interface. I'm like, yes. And he's like, so, tell me about, I want to know how it works now. Is it really making it fun? And I'm like, well, I'd say I wouldn't define it as fun, but it is a little less painful. And the room goes dead silent, and Ken just sort of looks at me and goes, ouch. But I mean, that was the reality of, the where it was on the project. I mean, it was very much a grognardy project, and it was not being handled particularly all that well. And so, again, telling the truth the way that I sometimes do get me in trouble. After that meeting, they were like, what were you doing? I'm like, anyway.
Just out of curiosity, were you involved at all with Outpost 1 or just Outpost 2?
Yeah, no. Outpost 1 was, long. It was a, historical product when I got there. I got there in 94, and Outpost 1, I don't know when it was, but it was before that. So actually, I'm sure I could look it up.
Well, actually, I think Outpost comes out a little bit. I mean, it was in development hell for forever.
It was. No, you're right. It came out in 94. I think I joined right after it landed.
Yeah.
But no, I worked on Outpost 2,
Gotcha.
which was, a few years later. And so anyway, like I said, the first couple of years there were great, right? It was a really interesting place. Worked on CyberStorm. Worked on Red Baron 2, and well, there's a story in that one. I'll talk about that in a minute. And actually, I worked on what was to be the sequel to Aces of the Pacific, Aces of the Pacific 2, which led to be candid, one of the very highlights of my entire life. So we had a relationship that was developed by one of our historians, our researchers, who had developed a relationship with a person who was a member of the Japanese Zero Fighter Pilot Association. And he became something of a liaison between us and that organization. Now, we were passionate historians and interested in these types of military simulation games. And so we negotiated through this liaison to take a trip to Japan to interview these members, pilots mostly, navigators, but navigators, pilots, and others who are part of two organizations, the Zero Fighter Pilots Association and the Unabarakai. And so I actually was asked to and did lead a small team to Japan. Went over there with a film crew, or actually we got a local film crew, but went over there with my team, right? So it was game designer, historian, myself, our audio director. And we basically spent 2 weeks going around Japan, interviewing these people who understand that, in the mid to late 90s, this was still not a thing that those people talked about. Most of those people were very, very quiet about their history, and many of them carried a great deal of sort of personal trauma, as you would imagine. Especially when dealing with a culture where honor and personal honor are as important as they are. And so it was one of the most moving experiences of my life. I was the guest of honor at the Zero Fighter Pilots Association meeting. I was able to speak to these people and, about our collaboration. And, we captured unbelievable amounts of incredible interviews and footage, which unfortunately will never see the light of day. Because after the demise of Dynamix, it basically went through a series of hands, and it is believed to have ended up in the archives of Activision, where it vanished into the ether. And so as far as I know, and I have been in touch with our audio engineer who would have had some of those materials, but he was a good boy when we all, went away. He turned everything in like we were supposed to. He didn't keep it. And as we know, that footage is all lost, which is just awful. But that experience was, an experience of a lifetime. I can't begin to describe how moving it was to be able to sit down with these men who were just remarkable individuals, and were telling their stories of the difficulties of that conflict. One gentleman took us into his home. He was very successful at this point, obviously elderly, but he was a very successful businessman. So he was in a very upscale part of Tokyo, led us into his home, and brought out a whole range of memorabilia, laid out a map for us of the Pacific on his table. It was just covered with kanji, allowed us to examine all these artifacts, talk to us about all of them. And I asked him about the map, and I was like, can you explain this to me? And he explained that he was a wing commander for the Japanese Navy, but land-based Navy. There was a bit of a thing between. Okay, anyway, and he explained sort of all of what this was basically all the places that they had been stationed and their battles, and a bunch of information. It would have been considered very secret back in the time. And I asked him about all of the writing all over the map. He's like, those would be the names of all the pilots that I lost.
Oh wow!
And he recorded all of them onto this map. And it was just an incredible thing. I met a man who had been a human torpedo pilot that had in fact been dropped in combat at the Battle of Okinawa. But his torpedo malfunctioned, the engine died, and it sank. And there's not much honor in just drowning, so he climbed out and swam back to shore and survived.
Jeez.
And the guy who was our liaison, a gentleman by the name of Hiro Yoshida, was in the air when Hiroshima happened. So he was in the air and witnessed it from a distance, obviously, but he was flying combat air patrol at the time. So it was an experience, and it was definitely something that I'm incredibly grateful for having had that opportunity. I'm so very sad that the machinations of American business and the failings of certain companies led to that footage being lost, because it would have been something. The good news is that that relationship did lead to other really fantastic, information transfer, and in fact, it led to a meeting between two, it's now somewhat famously, meeting between two pilots who fought in the Pacific, one Japanese, one American, who were actually in a dogfight together.
Oh, wow.
And the really entertaining story is the American pilot was returning from a mission. He had been shot up, so he was trailing smoke. And he was trying to make it back to his base. They got bounced by Zeros. and he was doing what he could do to sort of pull out, but there wasn't a heck of a lot he could do. Zero pulls up behind him, and he's like, well, I'm dead. There's nothing I can do. I'm in the middle of the ocean. Even if I bail out, I'm dead. So he was just like, that's it. And then the pilot, the Zero, pulled up alongside him, got waved at him, and then banked and left. And he's like, flies back to his base, survives the war. Fast forward, we got an opportunity for those two people to meet. And they did end up becoming fast friends, which is, of course, the best part of the story. But, of course, at some point during their meeting, the question came up of, what the heck, right? And to cut to the chase, the Japanese pilot was like, oh, yeah, I tried to shoot you down. I was out of ammo. I clicked, and it was dry, so I just figured, oh, good luck. I was like, oh, all right, fair. But they ended up both surviving the war and became good friends. And it was just, things like that did come from this event. So there was positives that came out of it. Anyway, I don't want to wax too much on that, but it was a very, very amazing trip. So that all happened within the first period before Ken disengaged and the company began to change. He handed over control to, for lack of a better term, accountants. It became very much a business about looking at numbers. And that whole experience very much changed. The tenor of the company changed. The focus of the company changed. They started bringing in new leadership. And that new leadership sort of treated it in a very different way. When we did the sequel to CyberStorm, it went through a really interesting period where we were getting pulled a whole bunch of different directions, and it was CyberStorm 2 is a game that I'm still proud of, despite the fact that it was not a great game. And I'll simply say that the story on that one was simply put, leadership had very strong opinions about what we should do. And so what started out as basically an 8-player, expanded version of the first CyberStorm, partway into development, probably good 9 months into development or 8 months into development, something like that, 6 to 8 months. I get pulled in and they're like, so, Caesar 3 is doing really well, and real-time games are really a thing now. Real-time strategy games are really in, and they're really selling. Command and Conquer, right? Oh. And so they're like, we want you to make CyberStorm 2 real-time. And I'm like, we're 8 months into development. We have an engine. It's a turn-based engine. And they're like, yeah, but, go do it. So I go back to the team, and I'm like, and so I talk about it with them, and Steve Gordon is like, well, maybe what we can do is we can effectively do this thing where it's still kind of turn-based, but we just, we don't stop for turns. We just sort of run it. And so he came up with a mechanism to inject real-time into a turn-based game. And it was okay. But we then get it to basically beta, and we present to CGW during one of the press events. And so they're going through the whole slate of games, and I get up there and I show them CyberStorm 2. And I'll never forget, the editor looks at it and he goes, of all the turn-based strategy games that came out last year, that was the one that I didn't think needed to be real-time. And I'm just like, oh, shit. And of course, what do you expect? Right after the meeting, they come back to me and they go, so what about turning it back into a turn-based game? I'm like, are you kidding me? And so there was a lot of that sort of thing, right? We knew where it was headed, and there was a lot of sort of desperation plays. Red Baron 2 got really mired in development, and there's a story about that, but I don't want to go into too much of the details because I don't want to get too personal with anybody. But I will say that it was a troubled development. I was on that one, not the director, I was the producer, and there was somebody else who was the director, and we were often not in alignment. And I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, there was a lot. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, just to clarify, Red Baron 2 is what was released as Red Baron 3D, or?
No, there was a Red Baron 2 release, but yes, it became Red Baron 3D. Red Baron 2 got released, and then Red Baron 3D was based on everything that Red Baron 2 was. Red Baron 2, let me put it to you this way. Red Baron 2 is probably the most highly accurate simulation of World War I aerial combat ever made. Which is to say that most of the time when people went up on sorties, they didn't actually fight. There you go. It's accurate. Doesn't make a great game. Not really a great game decision. You see where I'm going.
Yeah. Okay. Was that your plan or the?
That was the game director's passion, that it be as accurate as possible to World War I authentic aerial combat.
Only without the combat.
Well, there is combat. But the problem was that he wanted to have it to be accurate to what it was like to be a World War I pilot, authentically. Yeah, so there was those types of decisions that led to the game not being very good. And, you know, I was much more of an Aces of the Pacific kind of guy. I don't know if you remember Aces of the Pacific, but, you know, that was hey, I can sort of fast forward to the interesting parts. Now we'll fight the interesting parts. Now I can fast forward back. Yay! You know, I want to play the fun. I want the fun parts. He was not a big fan of that idea. So, yeah. Anyway, Red Baron 3D, however, was something that came out of the efforts that Red Baron 2 went through, right? So you might say the Red Baron 3D was sort of the penultimate result of that. I was only peripherally connected to, Red Baron 3D. You know, I was working on a number of other projects, some XDev projects, and also I ended up being pulled in on Starsiege, which...
Can I stop you right before we get to Starsiege?
Yeah.
Because according to Moby Games, you also have some credits on games from Software Sorcery. Conqueror 1086, and also Fast Attack.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know, what's the story there? What was the relationship? Because I don't recall Software Sorcery being one of Sierra's in-house studios.
You're very right. So I'll tell you the story.
Sorry if I've opened up a can of worms. No,
it's completely okay. So the story on those games is pretty simple. And actually there's a very useful lesson that I learned from the experience of that. And I will explain that lesson in a minute. Well, no, it's part of it. So, one day, working away on all the other projects I have on my plate, Tony Renicky comes to me and he goes, "Hey, we've got an opportunity to publish a couple of games. They just need to be wrapped up. They're basically there. They're at beta, but we just need somebody to finish them up. And so I'm wondering if you can take this on." And what I said to him was, well, yeah, but I'm going to, that's going to pull me in a lot of different directions. I don't know how much, I can do to affect the quality of their outcome, especially if they're this far along. And for me to really deep dive into them is going to take time that I don't have because I'm working on these things over here. And he's like, "Great, awesome, thanks." And that was the end of the conversation. And what I learned from that is the difference between saying yes, but and saying no. If I had said no, what would have happened is you would have been like, why? And then I would have explained. And he was like, well, okay, but we're okay with that. I want you to do this because here's the reason. So I'm like, great. Everybody would have been aware of what's going on and why the decisions would have been a mutual. We've made this decision. Instead, I said yes, but, and he stopped listening after the word yes. He heard nothing I said past yes. He just heard yes, and that's it. So, yes, I in fact became the external producer, whatever, publishing producer for those two games. He was correct that they were mostly done. They were also mostly bad. and so what they really needed was an overhaul. And when I went back and said, hey, we need to really do some work here to, he was like, no, you said, I've committed. We've got this date. We got to get them out here. And I was just like, okay, I guess we'll ship them when you said we'll ship them. So, long story short is, yes, we shipped them. They were purely external development. Had nothing to, it was literally, they wanted a publisher and he decided we were it. And they cut some sort of a deal, which I will never have any awareness of. And we published them. And they were not great. They were, 90% done when they reached me. And all we were able to do was really clean them up, debug them, get them, ready for market, but not have any meaningful impact on their content.
Understood.
So that's the short form. Well, medium form. It gave you enough of the backstory nuance. But yeah, it's actually not a touchy subject because it really was a very useful lesson for me. Because I don't think, I can't say I haven't done that since, but I've been a lot more aware of when I say yes to things like that, doing it in a different way. So anyway.
Gotcha. No, because I just saw those and I was like, okay, what is the connection but Sierra was putting out a lot of product at that time that didn't seem to be coming from internal studios that was of very varying quality, which wasn't necessarily helping the Sierra brand at the time.
No, and these were largely decisions that were being made by corporate leadership. In the case of that one was asked of Tony by others, and then Tony asked me. But these all came down from on high, and basically we were asked to execute. And so we did, and to the best of our ability. But yeah, it was a pretty tumultuous time at that point, right? Ken had punched out at this point probably 2 years earlier, right? And so it had just been on the downward spiral. We'd gone through multiple ownership changes. I don't know what I can say. I don't know what kind of words I can say on your cast, so I'm going to be careful here. Let's simply say that what the benefits of being part of the big company was that they would have something that, the big company would give us every year as, hey, you're part of the big company. So the first year when CompuCard International had us, we all got free entertainment books. Remember those with the coupons? And yeah. So we got free entertainment books. And then we got picked up by Sendent, and I forget what the heck Sendent did for us, but it, they basically give us like a tote bag or something like that. And then Vivendi was access to their services, and I'll just be very vague and leave it at that. But they have very specific types of access to certain services, online services, and I'll just say that. Anyway, it was very entertaining, but at the same token, it was not great because the company was coming apart, right? Leadership was giving us the kind of directives like I was getting on CyberStorm 2 with like, go this way. No, wait, go that way. No, go this other way. And people were changing with some frequency. And we were all just trying to make games, right? It was a team that was really passionate about making good games. And it felt like we weren't ourselves anymore. But there was a really strong sort of spirit among the people in the company One thing that did cause is a little bit of a internal rift. Not really. Rift is the wrong word. Fracturing, in that the internal teams became kind of distinct teams and were kind of separated to some extent. And the gap between us and the what do they call them? JTP, Jeff Tennell Productions, which is the people who did The Incredible Machine and all that stuff. The distance between the groups was greater. They were kind of off doing their own thing, doing, the Incredible Machine stuff and Trophy Bass and what have you. And that was just, we just sort of saw it go by and we're like, oh, okay, cool. But we really weren't aware of what they were doing. They weren't aware of what we were doing. It just felt weird because the company was sort of having these dividing lines and the groups were really separated from each other, even physically in the building.
Now, you're in Oregon at this point still?
Yeah, this is Eugene, Oregon. The company, most of us, JTP was off-site, but the rest of us were all on an upstairs floor of a University of Oregon campus building. So the ground floor was University of Oregon, and the upper floor was us. Very nice building right by the river. I loved Eugene. I really did. It's hard to be mad about living in a place where rush hour, we used to joke about rush hour being rush minute. That 1 minute right before 6 o'clock, it got a little busy. There was a little traffic on the bridge, and then that's it. You're done. It's a city of 100,000 people, most of whom are associated with the university in some fashion. So it was a very, very different experience from living in like Seattle or, the Bay Area. But anyway, the company at this point was really beginning to feel like it was losing its way. Leadership was changing. And then eventually they brought in Dave Gronowetsky, who, they got rid of Tony Renicky. They brought in Dave Gronowetsky, who, in corporate speak is a hatchet man. And his job was to effectively come in and trim the fat, which is to say, start laying people off. And that happened pretty quickly. And so he started out by laying off most of the senior folks. And that led to me getting laid off. It did lead to a really great story because my wife was working here at the time now. She was a very, very good quality assurance tester. And they actually, when they decided to lay me off on my birthday, by the way, it was pretty funny. I got two things on my desk when I came in the morning. It was a little thing saying, happy birthday. Here's 2 movie tickets. We hope you have a great day. And another one saying, please come see HR.
Oh,
It's like, wow. Okay. Thanks. I still have those movie tickets, by the way. They're not here, but I have them. I kept them for posterity because it makes a good story. But when they laid me off, they actually went to my wife and said, so we have to lay off your husband, but we're hoping you'll stay. She's like, are you kidding? Where he goes, I go. So no. It was funny stuff. Anyway, so yeah, this was now in '99. So I'd been there for 4.5 years, pushing 5. But the wheels were coming off, and so they, Dave Gronowetsky came in and he sort of cut a whole bunch of senior staff, or rather got the leadership, which was at the time Randy Dersham, I think, to sort of start hatcheting people. But truth be told, it was for the best. The company was, we know that, I don't even remember what year they cratered, but it was not that much longer past that point. Yeah. And when they did crater, it was even worse than that, right? They did the classic, hey, let's all go out to an on-site while we lock the doors. So I got to miss that one. But it was just very, very sad. Dynamix was a great, great company. The only good news is that it led to the spawning of some interesting studios like Pipeworks, which was a derivative of Dynamix. Some of those very, very talented people became the heart of that, that startup. So those people have, by and large, gone off to great careers in various places in the industry, including local to Eugene. And so it was an incredible team full of really talented people that I'm honored to have had a chance to work with. And I don't regret for a minute the time I spent at Dynamix, even though it ended the way it did. But, you know the story of the industry. A lot of it ends that way.
Sad but true. And personally, Dynamix is one of my favorite developers of all time, but I was a fan of the era before your time there, back in the C64 and early PC days.
Yep, Betrayal of Krondor and... Yeah.
No. Way back. We're talking
way back.
Olympics, Project Firestart,
Okay.
Die Hard. Those were that was the Dynamix of my youth. But I've interviewed Damon Sly, the co-founder.
Sure. Yeah.
And reminisced about those days. But the spirit of Dynamix, that experimentation, that really going out there and finding the fun in the games and so forth, that you're describing is exactly what was always the hallmark of that company.
I agree completely. And that was very much the company that I joined. And unfortunately, it was very much the company that disappeared around 96, 97. And it was gone. And so at that point, it was just only a matter of time before, the inevitable end. But it was a great place to work. And I'm very grateful for the time that I got to spend there and the friendships that I made from there.
Now, I did cut you off earlier. You were about to go into Starsiege a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Well, so there's amusing backstory here. And I promised you a reference to Tribes as well. So I had nothing really to do with Tribes. It was a different team working on that project. And very, very talented team as well. But there's an interesting little backstory here that I just find very amusing in hindsight. So, as you know, I'm a passionate tabletop guy. I reached out to a little-known company called Games Workshop and brokered a conversation about, hey, what about us partnering with you? And we have we have some games in development that we'd like to talk about potentially turning into Warhammer or Warhammer 40K, more correctly, games. And they're like, oh, that sounds interesting. We're super excited. And so they came out, which was a really, really interesting conversation. So understand, this is mid-90s Games Workshop, right? So they were just game nerds, right? So when I pick them up at the airport, they're just regular Joes. And I'm like, going to take them out to dinner because it's the business thing, right? And I'm like, where do you want to go? They're like, Taco Bell, man. We want to go to Taco Bell. I'm like, wow. So I took them to Taco Bell because that's what they wanted. And they were great. They were interested in what we were doing. Obviously, I was a huge fan of what they were doing. And long story short, I engineered a deal for us to basically leverage the 40K stuff into our games. Could have been for Tribes, could have been for what eventually became Starsiege, but they were very interested, right? And the Earth Siege universe was an internal IP, but it wasn't an IP of any note, right? And so they were willing to partner, and so we cut a deal, or rather, I got them to agree to terms, and those terms, in hindsight now, were ludicrously cheap, right? They were looking at, like 1.5 points or something like that.
Oh, wow.
And like, 50K or something ludicrous like that. And they were ready to sign the deal, and leadership said, we'll just do our own stuff. And so they backed out of the deal. And I'm like, okay. And so I had to call them up and say, sorry, guys, they want to do something else. So thanks, but no thanks. And a partnership that could have been, obviously, from my previous mention of the SSI, this was a passion of mine, was to try and connect the dots between tabletop companies and video game companies, because I felt that there was creative synergies to be had. And so while I did end up becoming friends with the guy who eventually became their head of licensing for Games Workshop, and I have a amusing story about that guy too, but it ended up not being fruitful. So it makes for a good story now, but it is a sad thing, in hindsight, that it didn't come to fruition, because it could have, and it could have been great.
Yeah. So I have to ask, was it going to be a complete abandoning of the Earthsiege storyline and just replace the units with Warhammer units, or?
We didn't get that far. We basically just saw that there was an opportunity to do something here that could have really been interesting. And, the answer is potentially yes. And the reason that the Dynamix side walked away is because they wanted control of the IP. I get it. I do. But
yeah.
Obviously, hindsight, that IP did okay, just saying. And so anyway, but I did end up making, a friend in John Gillard, who became their head of biz dev. I think he's left them now or retired now. I forget which. But there's an amusing John Gillard story that I'll tell just because it makes me laugh. So I'm going to look this up to see if I can remember exactly what year it was. Maybe you'll know. Do you know what year E3 was in Atlanta?
Oh, now you got me. That I don't know. Let's see. The Wikipedia for E3 has got to have that.
You would think that.
It's got to have a list of all the different E3s.
Yeah, you would think. I just don't remember. But anyway, it doesn't matter. But it was one of the years where we went to Atlanta to E3. And
97 and 98.
There you go. Okay, so it was one of those two. It was right in this period when I was having these negotiations, right? And my brother at this time was at Dynamix, and so he and I and John went out to Hard Rock Cafe, because we're all at E3 together, and John forgot his passport. Now, at the time, John was in his early 30s, but had a very baby face. And he forgot his passport. We tried to get in the door at Hard Rock Cafe, and they wouldn't let him in.
Oh, wow.
Despite the fact that he was like 30.
Oh, geez.
So we literally had to go back to John's hotel to get his passport so we could get in to have a beer with the guy. So anyway, it's a shame because it was a really potentially incredible partnership and it just didn't happen. It's probably for the best for them, because obviously the company was not in a great place at that time. But anyway, it is what it is. But now it just makes an amusing story.
Yeah. So
anyway, so Starsiege. So that was actually the last project that I worked on at Dynamix. And I wasn't officially to be on the project, but the guy in charge of the project got cancer, which sucks.
Oh.
And I was asked to step in, and the project was a little bit off rails, and I was asked to step in and kind of, you're in charge, but you're not really in charge. You have to run everything past us, but you're kind of running the day-to-day. And, oh, by the way, it needs to be as good as it can be. And so please do what you can to get this thing out the door. And so I worked very closely with the engineering lead, who I had a very good relationship with. And I ended up redoing a bunch of mission design because there was some really bad mission design in there. But so it was a weird job. I was like sort of this hybrid producer, pseudo director, pseudo designer guy trying to help get the thing out the door and trying to hold the team together during a tough time. And obviously, that nothing against the guy who got cancer. He got cancer, so it was not his fault that he had to step aside. And I'm in no way intimating that he was doing something wrong, because I couldn't even speak to how it got into the shape that it was in, but it needed some help. And so I jumped in with both feet, and it was another of those firefighting moments where I basically tried to hold as many hats as I could. Like I said, I did a bunch of level design. I did the producer thing and tried to wrangle all the pieces together to get the game out the door. And we went from a pretty bad place to a pretty good place in about 4 months. And, you know, I mean, it's not a most amazing game of all time, but, you know, it was done and pretty solid when it got out the door. So it's a game that I'm proud of, despite the fact that I only had 4 months with it, I think. And it was from like, you know, I think I got onto the project in like November, and then, you know, they laid me off on my birthday in February. So,
oh, Jesus.
And then it published shortly thereafter, right? But basically, I got it final, and then I'm out, or rather,
wow.
thank you for your service.
Oh, that's. I mean, in a normal job, getting booted is obviously terrible, but in a creative job where you've got product coming out, where you've made creative decisions, that's gotta have a very particular sting.
It does. I mean, it wasn't my game. It wasn't like I was there from the inception, right? I had been a contributor because I was very passionate about that type of game, and so I had contact with the game for a while. You know, I'd worked. You know, I had friendships with some of the design team. Like I said, the lead engineer and I were close, so you know that I was pretty close to the project, even though I wasn't on the project. And you know, I was working sort of in parallel, but it was certainly something that I was, you know, interested in, passionate about. You know, I like games of that ilk in general. I was a huge fan of the games it was trying to compete against. And obviously, you know, that type of a game system, you know, the giant robots thing is a passion of mine. I've been a BattleTech player since the olden days. I actually think officially I won the Gen Con Open in, I want to say, 89. So something like
wow.
So I was, you know, a competitive player at a couple of different games, and that was one of them. So yeah, that and Starfleet Battles, where I want to say Starfleet Battles, I basically took second. I basically came in second to John Van Cannigan, the founder of New World Computing. And I will never forgive that son of a bitch for that game, but that's a whole different story. But I digress. So anyway, yeah, Starsiege was a game that I worked on for a limited amount of time, but I very much, you know, had a hand in helping get out the door. Is the best way I can put it.
Gotcha. Now, just very briefly going back to CyberStorm.
Sure.
Because Sierra had the Imagination Network at the time, and CyberStorm, just looking at the packaging, talks about, you know, modem and network play.
Yep.
Was there ever a discussion of trying to make an Imagination exclusive like Cerberus had been?
And the answer is yes, but that discussion was relatively brief, mostly because I think it was a couple of years too late, right? In other words, you know, INN was kind of doing this, and, you know, so it just, at the time, it didn't feel like it was natural fit. And they were still trying to figure out really how to get INN to resonate. I mean, you know how INN was. It was kind of all over the map, and it was trying to figure it out. To their credit, they were trying to do something that they had a great vision. They didn't execute it great, but the idea was great. It had real merit, right? They just, you know, the technology of the time, the timing of it, and, you know, sort of their approach to, let's see if it sticks. It was ultimately probably the thing that prevented it from becoming, you know, what it could have become. But I mean, I have a lot of positive thoughts in regards to what INN could have been in a different time or with different guidance, or, it's just one of those things where it could have been something and it ended up being not the thing that it could have been in another universe, in another time. And it's a shame because there were some very talented people that worked very hard to put that thing together. And I think what it represented really sort of, opened eyes to various possibilities that hadn't really, coalesced in that way before. So there's a lot of creative thoughts behind that network. But to your question, yes, it was considered. I remember a discussion about it, but it didn't go anywhere.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking the synergies. One other thing, because we've been talking about the different platforms you worked on through all these years.
Yep.
CyberStorm is a Windows 95 program.
Yes, it is.
Those other games that you worked on for what was the name of the company? Sorcery something or other.
Yep.
Those were still DOS games, if I'm reading the stats correctly.
You're correct. That was right in that
so
time.
What from a developer standpoint, especially from the person who has to supervise these projects, which are not, it's not like, we're going to make the game on the weekend or something.
Right.
How were those decisions made internally? Okay, this is going to be a Windows game. This is going to be a DOS game. When those first transitions began happening, how was the decision process inside of Dynamic like?
Oh, I wish I could tell you that it was a lot more sophisticated than it was, but it really wasn't. It was exactly the way that it is more often than not, which is sort of like haphazard. And, so like the DOS games, those were because those games had been in development for a while, and, it wasn't even a thing until it became a thing. Right. Whereas, internal games, obviously we're trying to keep up with the times. And so as the industry evolved, we tried to evolve with it. And so there was a lot of that, okay, we need to shift and we need to be on this platform. And for us, it was just another platform, right? And really, it's no different than anything else. So it means, okay, this is now the thing we need to be playable on. And that means that we have to do this from a development side. So, but I would love to tell you that there was a grand plan. There was not a grand plan. It was very much, oh, geez, that. Okay, well, then I guess we should do this, right? There's a lot of that. It was not anything more sophisticated than that, I'm afraid to say.
Okay. And from a technical standpoint, it wasn't problematic, or?
Not really. Again, one of the things that we were blessed with internally was frighteningly, terrifyingly smart engineers. And so, I mean, again, I've mentioned how multiplayer happened in CyberStorm. That's the kind of thing where it's just like, none of that stuff fazed these people. And so they would just sort of go, oh, okay, cool. And it really wasn't, it didn't inhibit us particularly. It complicated matters from a standpoint of some amount on the development, certainly on the testing. But it didn't really require any special shenanigans. It didn't really stick in my head as something that was particularly painful.
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
So that concludes part 2 of our interview. Come back next time when we'll find out where Graeme will end up after his time at Dynamix/Sierra. Trust me, it'll be interesting.
I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.